mean, none of you know who I am or what I do, but for the American Action Forum. But let me assure you, promptly at 7 a.m. every morning, Doug Holsegan calls me. He says, "Fred, what did we do today? What's your take on the economy?" And he promptly goes out and reflects it to the world. True? Hardly, hardly. We are very proud of this new space and really proud of this inaugural event here with Doug and Senator Portman, who really needs no introduction. I must say that over the last 4 years, one of the great pleasures of my life has been working with somebody who is a true professional and a great team of people who consistently fight way beyond their weight. I think the impact they've had on policy in this country is dramatic, and it's just very proud to be associated with Doug and the team. So without further ado, Doug Holsegan.
Well, I have two great jobs this morning. The first is to just be introduced by Fred Malek, who is chairman of the board and founder of the American Action Forum. I want to just echo everything he said about what a great privilege it's been for me in the past 4 years to work with Fred and how proud we are of this space and to have this our first event in it. My second wonderful job this morning is to introduce the senator from Ohio, Rob Portman, who does need no introduction, but I'm a big fan. Outside of his allegiance to the evil Cincinnati Bengals, he's a wonderful guy, and he's contributed a great deal to this country, both as a member of a family business, as a representative in the House from the state of Ohio, as the U.S. Trade Representative, and as the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, which is one of the tough jobs in Washington, in which he carried off with just tremendous style and elegance. And he is now representing the state of Ohio. He is bringing to that job both vision for growth and sound economic policy, something that this country desperately needs, as well as a willingness to reach across the aisle and have the practical skills to get things done. And so I'm thrilled that he can be here this morning to talk about the outlook for the budget and what he expects to see in the President's budget. And we welcome him to the podium. Senator.
Doug, thank you very much. Yeah. Thank you, Doug and Fred. Great to see you. To have the esteemed Mr. Malek here is steps up our game a little bit. Appreciate your support of this organization too, as Doug and Gordon, who's somewhere in the audience, will tell you. Gordon Gray, my former budget staffer, who Doug stole from me. I rely on these guys a lot. They do a terrific job giving us information and helping, as Fred said, to mold the debate here in Washington, D.C. So it's a privilege to be here. I'm glad to see your new space and to be your first speaker here. Doug, I can say a lot about. I'll be careful here because I know him very well, and I won't tell any personal story, but I will say he's a straight shooter, and he is not one of these economists who kind of tells you it could be one way or it could be another. He kind of tells it like it is, and at least his opinion, which is usually right. There's a story around town that when Harry Truman was president, economists would come into the Oval Office and they would say, Mr. President, on the one hand this could happen, on the other hand something else could happen. And in great frustration, Harry Truman finally said to his chief of staff, "Bring me a one-armed economist." That's Doug. I mean, he does not. He does not give you the on the one hand, the other hand. He keeps one hand tied behind his back. So thanks for having me here. Doug tells it straight. I hope that I'll be able to tell it straight today, and I think it's time for a little straight talk and some truth about what's going on with our budget. I see some other great leaders on the budget battles here. Maya and I have worked on this for years, but let's be honest, we're in trouble as a country. And I am concerned that what I hear about the President's budget coming up on Tuesday, it will not be up to the task. The truth-telling needs to be told, but more importantly, the work needs to be done. It needs to be done, of course, on a bipartisan basis, which is the only way it can succeed. And the stakes couldn't be higher. Earlier this month, as you know, the Congressional Budget Office issued their first report in about 9 months. And a lot of attention was focused on what they said on Obamacare, and understandably so, because they said that it will result in fewer work hours and therefore a disincentive to work, leading to more unemployment. We already have, as you know, the highest number of long-term unemployed in the history of our country. We already have a worker participation rate that goes back to the 1970s. In fact, among men, it's at historic levels going back to the 1940s since we started keeping track of it. So, we already have big problems in terms of unemployment. However, that's not the speech I will give today, as much as I'd like to. Just to say that what the media didn't focus on in that report was what it said about our fiscal situation. And that was equally troubling. Because what it said was, even in the last 9 months, things have gotten worse, not better. You would hardly know that from, again, not just seeing the press accounts, but seeing how the administration has been responding, not just to that report, but through their leaks indicating what they're likely to come up with in this budget. You wouldn't know that CBO had just reported that things are worse, not better, another $1 trillion in debt projected over the next 10 years, to the point where now we're looking at a $10 trillion increase in the debt between now and 2024. So it's getting worse, not better, and CBO also was very specific about what's going to happen. $1 trillion deficit's coming back at the end of this 10-year period. And the reason for it, they laid out in very clear terms. When it comes to our nation's finances, we're kind of witnessing a slow-motion train wreck, but we all see it coming. And it has to do with one thing, and that's mandatory spending. And in particular, the unsustainable growth of important, vital, but unsustainable entitlement programs, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and then, of course, interest on the debt. In the CBO report, as you know, they said we'll have, in the 10th year, a debt payment alone of over $800 billion. These obligations, of course, are on autopilot. They're not subject to these annual spending fights we see in Congress. I see someone's brought a wonderful chart here, so I'll refer to it. But this is where we are today. If you look at the red and the purple together, so this would be mandatory spending is about 65% of the budget. So about 2/3 is mandatory and about 1/3 is discretionary spending. This is where we'll be in 10 years from now. This blue will become even a bigger part of the budget, to the point instead of 65, 66%, we're looking at 76, 77% of the budget. So over 3/4 of the budget will be on autopilot, mandatory spending. And that's the story in the CBO report that is most concerning. In fact, they say that among the healthcare entitlements, which include now Medicare, Medicaid, and Obamacare being a huge new entitlement, there will be a 115% increase over this 10-year period. We see 10,000 new baby boomers retiring into Social Security and Medicare programs every day. So it is no mystery as to why this is happening. CBO actually, in their report, while focusing on mandatory spending, also made some other interesting observations. One is that the other sort of two elements that you would think of in terms of affecting the budget over the next 10 years are not the problem. One would be the revenue side. They say that we're not undertaxed, and by that I mean that they say by next year, 2015, the taxes, as a percent of the economy, which is how you ought to measure it, will be back up to their historical level. And then for the rest of the 10 years, we'll get to above the historical level. And in the next couple of decades, we'll be at record levels. So hard to say we're undertaxed. In fact, what they do say is that economic growth will be less than they had projected only 9 months ago. Therefore, it is clear that they're not suggesting that we ought to do more to hurt the economy. And that's what tax increases would do on the current antiquated and outdated tax code. Rather, this is clearly to me an indication we need tax reform, because the growth is so important for us to deal with the debt and deficit, and the $1 trillion in additional debt is largely attributable to the fact that they're projecting lower economic growth. So it's not taxes. The other part, of course, would be discretionary spending. And this part of the budget, CBO actually says, will be flat. In other words, the reason that there's a growth in the mandatory side is that this part of the budget, thanks in part to the Budget Control Act, is not growing at the rates that you see on the mandatory side. So as a percent of the economy, they actually say that the discretionary spending is likely to fall. So the problem is pretty clear. So people say, well, Rob, what about government waste, fraud, and abuse, foreign aid? I get this a lot back home. Those sorts of issues, corporate welfare. Clearly all are things that we ought to focus on. And specifically, as some of you know, one of my favorite budgetary targets is waste, fraud, and abuse. We can do more there. We can save billions. But I will say that even if we were to do everything we possibly could on the side of government waste, or corporate welfare, or foreign aid, in fact, take foreign aid all the way down to zero, of course it wouldn't come anywhere close to closing the long-term budget gap that the Congressional Budget Office and others have recognized. That's just reality. So should we continue to focus on these issues? Of course we should. And you know, the appropriations process, finally underway again, I hope, is important to prioritize spending and to provide for oversight. But we don't come close to addressing the budget gap we face unless we deal with the mandatory side of the budget. That's just a reality. Again, it's not easy it's not hard to understand why, because we are looking at this huge growth of the baby boom generation. Social Security is already in permanent deficit. What does that mean? It means that every year there's now billions of dollars going out, more than there are payroll taxes coming in. This year it's about $63 billion more in benefits go out than payroll taxes coming in. And that deficit continues indefinitely, based on the Congressional Budget Office and based on the trustees' report. Similar story with Medicare. The program now offers $3 in benefits for every dollar the typical retiree contributes in Medicare taxes. So think about that. When you combine taxes and premiums, you put in $1 for every $3 you get back. That's not a sustainable model. And then finally, with regard to Medicaid, we've seen it balloon to $574 billion. That is, by the way, triple the cost of Medicaid only 5.5 years ago at the end of the Bush administration. A tripling of costs in Medicaid. So that's the good news, by the way. When we talk about Social Security and Medicare's instability, we tend to focus on the depletion of the trust funds. And most people probably think that there's a pool of money somewhere in a trust fund that's available to be able to pay benefits. As you know, that's simply not true. And we as policymakers need to talk more about this issue and be frank with the American people about the situation. President Clinton's Office of Management and Budget had a moment of candor on this. It's a quote that I use sometimes. In the Clinton administration, they said, "These balances, trust fund balances, are available to finance future benefit payments only in a bookkeeping sense. They do not consist of real economic assets that can be drawn down in the future to fund benefits. Instead, they are claims on the Treasury that, when redeemed, will have to be financed by raising taxes, borrowing from the public, or reducing benefits or other expenditures." Point well taken. And so when we talk about what kind of shape Social Security and Medicare are in, we have to recognize that these trust funds are not trust funds in the sense most Americans think about them. They represent obligations that must be supported out of general revenues, and as those obligations grow larger, of course, so will our deficits. This debt spiral will spin even faster, of course, as interest rates go up. And thus, of course, the amount we have to pay to finance the debt. I mentioned the fact that CBO suggests it'll be about over $800 billion in the 10th year, just interest in the debt alone. As you know, for every 1 point increase in interest, it's now $140 billion more in deficit. Right now, the interest rates in the 10-year Treasury are relatively low, just under 3%. That's an historical anomaly that I think is unlikely to last. Think about this, interest rates were 6% in the 1980s on average, 8% throughout much of the 1980s. Already CBO projects that a decade from now, somewhat higher interest rates, of course, will push these payments up. As I said, their number is $880 billion a year. I think that's probably conservative, in other words, probably an optimistic view. It could be much worse. As part of that prediction, CBO assumes the rate on the 10-year bond will top out at just 5%, which again is lower than the typical rate either in the 80s or the 90s. So to be one of those economists that Harry Truman hated, on the one hand, we're facing nearly $1 trillion in yearly interest payments in 10 years. On the other hand, it could be a lot worse. It could be a lot more than $1 trillion over the next 10 years, a year in interest payments. So either way, it's bad news. And it doesn't take a mathematician to see that, therefore, we're sitting on this ticking time bomb of debt. The escalating national debt, driven by the rising cost of Social Security, Medicare, and economic recovery that we all hope will strengthen but hasn't. And then, of course, an end to the Federal Reserve's quantitative easing policies. All those we're seeing today, and all those have the possibility of pushing up interest rates potentially steeply higher, and therefore triggering this debt bomb and, of course, taking a lot of jobs, economic opportunity, and investment along with it. So, simply put, we're running out of time. As Erskine Bowles famously said before the Budget Committee on which I sit, this is the most predictable economic crisis in our nation's history. The President in his State of the Union address talked a lot about action. In fact, he said this should be the year of action. And well, let's do it. Let's take action to try to prevent this debt crisis that grows closer every day we do nothing. It won't be easy. It'll require leadership. And this leadership's got to come from Congress and the President. These programs, Social Security and Medicare, Medicaid, are incredibly important. They're critical programs to those many millions of Americans who depend on them. If you touch these programs, you know, they say you're touching the third rail of American politics. This is why the only time it's done effectively is when you do it on a bipartisan basis, as Tip O'Neill and Ronald Reagan did in the 1980s, the last time we really made any substantial reform to these programs. But they're obviously in trouble, and with our population aging, runaway deficits are coming. So that's the sobering part of the speech. Unfortunately, it's also the realistic part. Now for some optimism. It's easy to talk about what's wrong. It's harder to come up with solutions. The first solution, of course, is economic growth. We've got to grow the economy in order to create more growth revenues. This is why you'll see over the next couple of weeks some of us will be laying out an economic plan, a jobs plan that does have tax reform as part of it. And I applaud Dave Camp for coming out with a proposal yesterday that is pro-growth. I haven't seen the details of it yet. I don't think they're out there yet. And there'll be some concerns about specific elements of it. But absolutely, this is an opportunity for us to grow the economy on both the business side, the corporate side, and on the individual side. But it also includes regulatory relief. It includes using our energy resources we have, opening up more public lands, taking advantage of that fully. It includes, of course, dealing with trade and expanding exports. There are a number of ways we can grow the economy. We know that. These are areas where the President and Congress should come together. And the solution, obviously, is to grow the economy, increase revenues through growth, and at the same time restrain spending through smart reforms, including and necessarily on the entitlement side. So today I'm going to outline 3 ideas on that side, on smart reforms on the entitlement side, that can help us to avoid this otherwise inescapable economic future that Erskine Bowles talks about. And by the way, each of these proposals I'm going to talk about have bipartisan roots. Each of them have been proposals that have been out in the public discussion for some time, and all make sense. First is an accurate measure of inflation when calculating government benefits and taxes. This proposal the President had in his budget last year. It's called chained CPI, and the way the President outlined it, it affected, of course, both taxes and benefits, and he also protected those who were lower income seniors, depending on Social Security. Most economists I talk to, and I think most economists who follow this, support having this accurate measure of CPI. The Consumer Price Index ought to be based on a market basket that makes sense. That's what this proposal does. It ensures that this more accurate inflation measure is used, and this small step could reduce Social Security's long-term deficit by as much as 25%. So again, something that has bipartisan roots, something that's been out there. I sure hope that the rumors are wrong. I sure hope the President includes it in his budget again. He continues to stand by it because it makes sense. Second, let's expand the small amount of means testing that is currently in some of these programs. I will focus on Medicare today. Medicare means testing in Part B and Part D can and should be expanded, in my view. That would enable us to have significant savings in the first 10 years, probably equal to about $60 billion. The President had a proposal in his budget last year that in the first 10 years save $56 billion. But what's really interesting about this proposal is it expands in the out years dramatically. So instead of $60 billion in the next 10 years, it would be probably between $425, $450 billion of savings, which is the kind of proposals we ought to be advancing that deal with this long-term problem, begin to bend the curve. Currently under Medicare Part B and Part D, beneficiaries whose income is equal or greater to $85,000 as an individual, or $170,000 as a couple, are required to pay a little more in premiums. That principle should be applied more broadly. And again, that's where the President's own proposal focuses. He freezes those means testing thresholds until inflation carries the top 25% of seniors above those thresholds. And again, it comes up with the savings we talked about. Third, Medicaid requires reform. As I said, tripled in cost in the last 5.5 years, putting a lot of pressure on states' budgets, as we have heard from the governors even last week. So let's modernize it, and let's create a more flexible Medicaid system that has more flexibility with the states to be able to do what works best for their populations, incentivizing more efficient care, slowing the growth in federal spending. One proposal is out there that I think is the one that probably has the most bipartisan support, is capping the amount of federal spending per Medicaid beneficiary, the so-called per capita cap. And this would include federal payments that automatically adjust to the state's enrollment and spending per beneficiary that grows at a predetermined index rate. That index rate is subject to debate and discussion. Most talk about CPI plus indexing. But it allows this safety net to continue that's so critical, but it also is one that does provide for the restraint that's needed and the reforms that are needed. By the way, this has a lot of bipartisan support. In 1995, President Clinton proposed a similar Medicaid reform plan, and all 46 members of the Senate Democratic Caucus at that time signed a letter voicing their support of the proposal. Some of those Democrats are still in the Senate. It included one of my Senate colleagues and President of the Senate, then Senator Joe Biden. It would make Medicaid more sustainable, clearly, as I've said. It also provides, again, more flexibility to implement reforms that are patient-centered, that deal with the population as it exists, to provide, in some cases, more managed care. In other cases, it provides more relief for chronic disease. Allow the states to use this to come up with better approaches to the folks who they're covering. The savings there are significant. Over the next 10 years alone, between $280 and $600 billion, depending on how it's structured. And again, longer term, it has even greater savings. And all three of these proposals, therefore, are examples of the kinds of things that people are looking for. The market's looking for them. The market is wondering whether Washington is ever going to get its act together. And by putting forward these kinds of proposals that have some short-term improvements in the deficit, but also significant long-term proposals, is exactly what the market and those who are concerned about our economy are looking for. In addition to, again, those pro-growth policies we talked about that create more jobs, expand opportunity, grow the economy, grow revenues, these proposals would have a substantial effect on our long-term debt. Most importantly, I think their impact on the American people is minuscule as compared to what will happen if we do nothing. And that's a point I think that we forget sometimes. If we don't do anything, what will happen? We discussed this debt bomb we're sitting on and the fact that it affects our kids and grandkids, and it does. I think it's an immoral burden that we are placing on future generations, the excesses of this generation passed along to our kids and our grandkids. But it's also about today's economy. The debt and deficit is a wet blanket over the economy. It is leading to a lot of investment staying on the sidelines. And finally, on this trust fund accounting issue we talked about, even if you assume these trust funds are real, and they are real in the sense that those obligations are there, but again require either more borrowing, taking money from other important priorities, or going further into debt, the trust funds themselves are in trouble. If we do nothing, think about this, most people retiring today who are joining the ranks of Medicare or Social Security, most of those folks retiring today will see the trust funds be depleted in their lifetimes. So this is new. The Social Security Disability Trust Fund, of course, is in the most trouble. It goes belly up in 2017, so just around the corner. But Medicare follows. The Medicare Trust Fund is insolvent in 2026. The Social Security Old Age Trust Fund collapses in 2035. And by the way, when that happens, as you know, every Social Security recipient will receive a 25% reduction in their benefits, like that. So talk about a major dislocation and talk about a major problem for our seniors. The money they depend on to survive is cut by a quarter. And again, this is when people retiring today, in terms of Social Security, the last of the trust funds to collapse would be in their early 80s. We can't let that happen. We obviously can't let that promise we've made be broken. And we can't do this to future generations. When it comes to Social Security and Medicare, the American people did invest their money. but more importantly, they've invested their faith, their idea, and the government won't let them down, and that's the trust that we can't betray. We can't sit back and watch as our economy craters under the weight of this rising debt. We can't allow entitlement spending to soar to a level that would require income tax rates to increase substantially. Income tax rates would have to more than double over the next couple of decades to handle these increased costs. So the choice is before us. We can either take these small incremental reform steps today, or we can live to see a time when these critical programs collapse of their own weight, and every American suffers because of it. President Obama knows this. His budget last year, again, included these adjustments to Social Security and Medicare. Just last week, some leaders in the Congress on the other side of the aisle sent a letter to the President asking him not to touch any entitlement programs. Why? Because they're worried about their reelection, and they're worried that if he does any of these relatively small steps toward dealing with our future problems, that it will affect their reelections. More concerned about the next election than the next generation. It's hard to imagine a worse abdication of our responsibility to the people who we are elected to represent. So I hope the President doesn't cave into the demands of these folks who are more worried about the next election. It has been leaked that the President may not just delete some of the mandatory reforms he had in his budget, but the President might, and I quote, instead focus on policies traditionally sort of supported by Democrats, such as tax increases. The Washington Post has reported that President Obama will, and I quote, call for an end to the era of austerity that has dogged much of his presidency. Austerity. It's kind of an interesting way to describe what's happened. Some of you have seen the movie The Princess Bride. There's a part of that movie where one of the characters says to the other one, I don't think that word means what you think it means. So, I mean, I don't know how you describe austerity, but $6.5 trillion in new debt over the last 5 years, to me, would not be austerity. The 5 largest nominal deficits in American history is not austerity. The creation of a new $1 trillion entitlement in the form of Obamacare is not austerity. Another way to put it, since 1947, there have been only 5 fiscal years in which the U.S. government has spent more than 23% of our total national economic output on spending. So in other words, spending has only been over 23% for 5 fiscal years. 3 of those fiscal years occurred in 2009, 2010, and 2011. So hardly a period of austerity. I guess I should say thank goodness the President doesn't think he went on a spending spree. But anyway, if what the Washington Post is reporting is true, we've got a much bigger problem on our hands than a president who won't work with Congress to solve these fiscal problems. We would have an administration that doesn't even acknowledge that we have a problem. And as in any problem, the first step is getting over your denial and acknowledging it. So let's hope the rumors aren't true. I hope the president won't take the easy way out and sort of give a political sop to his base, but instead propose the kind of real thoughtful budget that we need and we all hope for. President Kennedy once said that the reason we take on tough challenges, the reason we commit ourselves to do the important work of the country is not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And it is hard. We have to acknowledge that. Therefore, it's time for President Obama to dust off that Kennedy motto and show some leadership. I hope the President will include these serious proposals and at the same time bring down some of the deficit spending that does threaten our kids and grandkids and our future. But frankly, folks, he's got to do more than just that. He did propose budgets in 2011 and 2012 that came before the Congress and did not receive a single vote. Unbelievable. Not even Nancy Pelosi's vote or Harry Reid's vote. Not a single Democrat. So it's one thing to put out a budget, another thing to actually work your budget and to roll up your sleeves and get involved and engaged with the Congress. He's got to be willing to do that and stand up to members of his own party in order to deal with the very real problem that we've outlined today. President Clinton and Newt Gingrich didn't agree on a whole lot. You know, they had their issues, and yet they figured out ways to come together, even during election years, by the way, to solve problems. And you think about the 1997 agreement, you think about welfare reform. It seemed impossible at the time, but it happened, and President Obama can do it too. He doesn't have to accept the fact that they allows America to continue to see a decline in terms of wages, in terms of unemployment, in terms of opportunity and freedom and prosperity. America's best days, in my view, can be ahead of us, I strongly believe that it's going to take leadership not just from the President, but from the Congress, members of the House and the Senate. I do believe that America's best days can be ahead of us if we show that kind of leadership, and that includes the economic growth packages that we talked about earlier. Let's hope that it happens in this budget. Let's hope that we do see some coming together, even during an election year. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the American Action Forum for not just hosting me today, but for all the great work you do every day on these tough fiscal and economic issues. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator's on a tight schedule, but we're not going to let him go without asking some questions. You talked a lot about the politics, and I want to just push you a little bit on that. Yesterday, Dave Camp put out a tax reform. You heard a lot of Republicans talking about how it's a bad idea in an election year, shouldn't be doing this. Talked about letters from Democrats and not touching entitlements. So suppose the President puts out a serious budget, rolls up his sleeves, gets to work. What do you have to change in Congress to get people to do this?
First of all, you may see my statement on Dave Camp's proposal. As I said, I haven't seen the details, nor has anybody, I guess, but I applauded him. I mean, I think it's important for us to have this discussion. And specifically, we have a strong need right now to figure out ways to grow the economy in order to deal with our debt and deficit problem, and also to provide for the opportunities that are missing right now. $4,000 take-home pay reduction in the last 4 years is something that's not going to be addressed without economic growth, and tax reform is part of it. So broadening the base, lowering the rate, pro-growth tax reform makes sense, and I'm pleased that he put it out there even during an election year. I mean, what are elections about after all? They should be about, you know, how do you serve the people better? And the top issue among the American people is jobs and the economy. By the way, still up there, relatively high, is deficit reduction. And the two are related in the sense that you're not going to see economic growth, in my view, and the kind of strong recovery that we want until you deal with this issue, because it is a wet blanket over the economy. And then second, part of the way you deal with it is to have more growth revenues through the kind of pro-growth policies that Dave laid out. So I think even during an election year, Doug, some of this is possible, and it's happened before, and it would require, because of the election probably, more so than even in a normal year, both parties working together and providing cover one another to Democrats and Republicans.
Question from the audience. If you have one, please identify yourself and ask your question in the form of a question.
Questions? Yes. Yeah.
Hey, Darren Samuelson from Politico.
Darren?
I wonder if you could talk at all about your the likelihood of seeing a budget resolution, you know, this year from the House and the Senate. Do you think that we're actually going to move into a normal appropriations process, a normal budget process this year, given the election year and the political timing and the problems we've seen on that in the past?
Yeah, I think budget resolution or not, I think there's a very good chance we're going to finally see what has been missing really for the past 5 years, which is a more comprehensive budget process where you have both oversight and prioritization that comes from individual appropriations bills being worked on at the subcommittee level. We have the 302A, the top line already set. One reason I supported the budget, as you know, is because I felt so strongly we need to get back to appropriating. And the alternative was not just the possibility of a government shutdown, which was very real in January, but also the lack of an appropriations process, which has really, in a sense, you think about it, over the last several years, we've kind of been on autopilot for a lot of the government spending. You know, agencies and departments have not been subject to the oversight they should be. Most of the CR has been continuing spending and programs from the previous year. So that is an abdication of our fundamental constitutional responsibility in Congress. And the power of the purse comes with this obligation to do the oversight and prioritize spending. So I'm pretty hopeful, even in an election year, having talked to both Barbara Mikulski and Richard Shelby about this, both prior to my vote on the budget and since. I think they're serious about it, and I think they're underway because we have provided that framework with or without a new budget resolution.
I'm getting the high sign from here, so we'll have time for one more question. And if not, join me in thanking Senator Portman.
Thank you.